Skeptics believed that the answer wasn't that Flamel had used the Philosopher's Stone to create gold. They argued the truth was rather more mundane.
Alchemy could be an explanation for otherwise unexplainable wealth. But his money didn't come from alchemical transmutations. It came from very clever real estate speculations and from the fact that his wife came from 2 previous marriages with a considerable inheritance.
In about 1410, Flamel commissioned his own tombstone, decorated with strange symbols. His death was thought to have occurred soon after. He'd reached his 80s, no small feat in medieval times. Rumors began to circulate that not only had Flamel used the Philosopher's Stone to prolong his life, he had also faked his death to protect the secret. Some claim that proof lies in the fact that several new books bearing his name were published long after his supposed demise.
These showed up in the 16th and 17th centuries. Whoever wrote them, however, just put Nicholas Flamel's name on it because he had become a famous figure mythologically for alchemy by this time. And some of them were probably just written by booksellers or cobbled together by booksellers trying to get a good seller.
Flamel's claim to have created the Philosopher's Stone has never been proved. But his claims did ignite an even more frenzied search. And in the 1500s, one of the most powerful men in Europe took up the cause. He was intent on finding the secret of the Philosopher's Stone once and for all, and nothing would stand in his way. By the early 1500s, the search for the Philosopher's Stone had reached fever pitch. The substance reputed to bring immortality and to turn base metals into gold was the most sought-after object since the Holy Grail. No alchemist had yet discovered it, but Europe's ruling elite all recognized its potential power.
The kings and cardinals, nobles and popes were all interested in alchemy, firstly because it was the mainstream science at the time, but also, of course, it gave the great prospect of untold riches, and they wanted to have the riches for themselves.
Though European rulers frequently outlawed the practice of alchemy altogether, there was always one exception: the alchemist who worked for them.
Most monarchs really are not adverse to the idea of alchemy itself. They're just adverse to alchemy falling into the hands of the wrong people. So a crown-sponsored alchemist was a great asset.
No monarch was more interested in alchemy than Rudolf II von Habsburg, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, King of Bohemia and Hungary. Rudolf was prone to depression, and he was perhaps drawn to alchemy because he thought it might provide a cure.
Now, Rudolf is known to have been very interested in alchemy. Not only did he acquire several books on the topic, but also he engaged himself in alchemical transmutation. He oftentimes went down to his workshop that was located right there at the castle. The fact that Rudolf, who is at this time the emperor, would engage in alchemical practices seemed to many people to be below his status. What is a prince doing in a workshop? You know, he's supposed to be the head of state.
He was the Holy Roman Emperor, who was meant to represent the interests of the Vatican, and in fact was more interested in pursuing forbidden knowledge, occult knowledge.
But to find the Philosopher's Stone, Rudolf needed expert help. In the mid-1500s, he took an unprecedented step. He began inviting large numbers of alchemists to his royal estates in Prague. As many as 200 passed through his court.
He gathered together some of the greatest minds of Europe and made Prague the intellectual and cultural center, and set up laboratories throughout the Prague castle.
It's probably fair to say that if you were an alchemist in that period of time, in late 16th century, early 17th century, a visit to the Habsburg was certainly something that would improve your career.
Among those drawn to Prague was John Dee, a respected scholar in the court of Elizabeth I.
John Dee is incredibly significant in the 16th century in intellectual history. He's one of the foremost mathematicians in England. Queen Elizabeth I actually asks him to astrologically choose the day of her coronation.
Like many scientific minds of the time, Dee had a strong interest in alchemy. He had heard of the power of the Philosopher's Stone and devoted all his efforts to finding it.
Dee's interest in the Philosopher's Stone began, as far as we can tell, way back when he was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, when he began an extensive reading program in the great classic works of alchemy. He read Flamel, and he came to believe at this point that alchemy had the potential to unlock the secrets of how the world was put together.
But by 1580, Dee was no closer than anyone else to finding the Philosopher's Stone.
And for Dee, this seems to have been the moment when he began to cast around for a better, more reliable way to learn about the natural world. And it was at that moment that he felt God revealed to him a new path.
Dee put aside his alchemical flasks and crucibles and picked up what was known as a scrying crystal.
There was a widespread belief in early modern Europe that shiny objects could be stared into by someone who was uniquely sensitive to picking up sort of the messages that were reflected there. What Dee discovered, much to his chagrin, was that he was not one of those sensitive people.
For the process to work, Dee needed a partner.
He had to rely on a technician, another person who could see in those shiny objects. And he had a number of these technicians that are called scryers. The one that he seems to have had for the most time was Edward Kelly, a man of very murky origins that we don't know all that much about.
Some claim that Kelly had several assumed names and that his ears had been mutilated, something that in medieval times may have indicated a conviction for counterfeiting or fraud. But crucially, Kelly claimed to be a scryer, and this was exactly what John Dee needed.
That Dee was either extremely gullible or Kelly was very cunning, but probably both. He insinuated himself into Dee's family and became his irreplaceable assistant.
What happens is that the scryer describes seeing a great plane of crystal, and on that surface of crystal there are letters inscribed. And an angel stands on this sort of floor of crystal with a stick and spells out their message to Dee. Sometimes in English, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a completely different angelic language. So this was an enormously time and labor-intensive activity, and it's not something anybody would have taken on unless they truly believed that it had the power to reveal very deep and very profound secrets about the natural world.
But scrying wasn't without its dangers.
If scrying is about invoking and communicating with angels, the problem is, how do you know if it's a good or a bad angel? Lucifer, after all, was the most beautiful angel. He fell. How do you know the angel you're talking to isn't a bad angel manifesting as a good one to lead you astray and lead you to damnation?
For early European scientists, there wasn't a clear boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds.
Trying to find the Philosopher's Stone, the secret of transmuting the metals, was so difficult that in absolute desperation there might be some alchemists out there that appealed to supernatural agencies like demons in order to get that kind of knowledge.
Actually, science and magic, at least in the early stages of civilization, were not as disparate, were not as distinct as we now think they are. If you think about it critically, in magic, you take a series of objects and produce something totally unexpected from them. In science, you can be doing very similar looking things.
Dee and Kelly were convinced that the angels were assisting them. They began marathon scrying sessions. As Kelly consulted the crystal, Dee would write down the messages. One message was particularly remarkable.
The angels tell Dee and Kelly that after a period of 7 years of study and revelation, that they will be able to produce the Philosopher's Stone